The Velthary Council had been debating for 6 days. 6 days meant nothing to them. The Velthary measured time in deep cycles, slow, gravitational rotations of their home system around a binary pair of dying stars. A single deep cycle lasted what humans would call 41 years. 6 days, to the Velthary, was barely a breath, barely a blink. But the signal had come 6 days ago, and still no one had answered it. The chamber where the council met was not a room in the way humans understood rooms. It was a resonance space, a hollow carved into the living rock of asteroid Veltha 9, where sound traveled in spirals instead of straight lines, where every word spoken returned to the speaker slightly changed, slightly older, as if the rock itself was offering a second opinion. The walls were not decorated. The Velthary did not decorate. They believed that beauty placed on a wall was beauty stolen from a mind. 12 council members sat in a circle, each one resting in a cradle chair, a curved shell of biogrown calcium that matched the exact curvature of each member's dorsal ridge. The Velthary were tall, roughly 3 meters, with bodies that moved in segments like a series of decisions made by different architects at different times. Their lower halves were dense and rooted, for thick legs arranged in a square formation beneath a wide pelvis. Their upper halves were almost delicate, long, branching arms that split at the elbow into 2 forearms each, giving them 4 hands per arm, 8 hands total, all currently folded inward, a posture that meant deep uncertainty in Velthary body language. Their faces were the hardest thing for outsiders to read. No eyes in the human sense. Instead, a wide sensory membrane stretched across the front of the skull, thin, trembling, iridescent, that captured light, heat, pressure, and electromagnetic fluctuations simultaneously. When a Velthary looked at you, they were not seeing you so much as feeling the shape of your presence against their face. Council Speaker Orithvel stood at the center of the circle. She was the oldest member, 4 deep cycles, which made her somewhere near 164 human years old. She looked neither old nor young by any standard that mattered. Her sensory membrane was darker than the others, almost charcoal, with faint silver threads running through it like old lightning. When she spoke, the chamber spiraled her voice back to her, and she caught it, and it steadied her. "The signal has been verified," she said. "It is a standard coalition distress frequency. The Ceratha station has confirmed hull compromise on 3 of its 7 rings. Life support on rings 4 and 5 is operating at 11%. There are currently 9,214 residents aboard." 9,000 is not a large number, said Councilmember Drev from the eastern arc of the circle. Drev was the youngest member, barely 1 deep cycle old, and he had the habit of saying true things in ways that made them sound monstrous. "The station can be rebuilt. New residents can be sourced." "New residents cannot be sourced," Orithvel said quietly. "They are people, Drev, not inventory." "I meant no cruelty. I meant only that the mathematics are not in question," she said. "What is in question is our capacity to respond." She turned slowly, letting her membranes sweep across each member of the council. "We have 3 rescue vessels. All 3 are currently deployed. The Haven is at the Dust Corridor, assisting the Morkai colony. The Deep Thread is escorting the pregnant vessel fleet through the pale expanse. And the 9th consideration," she paused. "The 9th consideration has not moved under its own power in 14 months. Silence in the resonance chamber. The silence came back to each of them, slightly changed. "Then we cannot respond," said Councilmember Prathso, a wide, heavy member whose membrane flickered pale yellow when she was anxious and was currently pale yellow. "We must send a regret signal. We must tell them." "We already sent a regret signal," Orithvel said. 2 days ago. Standard protocol. "Then the matter is." "The matter," Orithvel said, "is that 4 hours after we sent our regret signal, we received a response." She reached into the cradle beside her and lifted a small resonance tablet, thin as paper, glowing faint blue. "Not from Ceratha station. From someone else entirely." The chamber waited. "From humans," she said. The word moved through the resonance space in a strange way. The words did not spiral back, as they usually did, just outward, like it had somewhere to be. Most members of the council had never dealt with humans directly. They knew them the way you know a weather system, by reputation, by the reports of others, and by the particular silence that fell when experienced travelers mentioned them in conversation. Humans were a young species. Embarrassingly young. They had only achieved interstellar travel 43 years ago, which in Veltari deep cycle terms was approximately one slow Tuesday. They were not members of the Interstellar Coalition. They were not members of anything, really. They existed in a kind of permanent provisional status, acknowledged, sometimes consulted, occasionally useful, and never fully trusted. They were strange. Every species that had encountered them said so. Not dangerous, strange. Not hostile, strange. Just strange. It was the kind of strange that made experienced diplomats rub their temples and reach for a strong drink. "What do they say?" asked Drev. Orithvel read from the tablet. Her voice was careful and flat, the way you read something you haven't yet decided how to feel about. "This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the Earth Continuance, Vessel Meridian. We received the Cerithus distress signal on standard coalition frequencies. We also received the Veltari Council's regret of non-response. We are in the region. We are available. We are coming. ETA, 11 hours. Please advise on docking protocol and atmospheric requirements for rings 1, 2, and 3. Vasquez." The chamber was quiet again. This silence did not spiral. It sat. "One ship," said Prath so slowly. "One ship," confirmed Orithvel. "Cerithus Station is a 7-ring orbital structure with a compromised hull," said Drev, and for once his voice had lost its clinical edge. He sounded genuinely puzzled. "Its emergency population alone is over 9,000. For a rescue operation of that scale, standard coalition protocol calls for a minimum fleet of 12 vessels," said Orithvel. "Yes. I know. And they're sending," Drev said, as if he needed to hear it one more time. "One ship." "One ship," she said again. Nobody spoke for a long time. The rock breathed around them. Somewhere deep in the asteroid, something ancient shifted and resettled. "Why?" said Prathso, very quietly. Orithvel set down the tablet. She looked at it for a moment, felt the shape of it with her membrane, the faint warmth of its glow, and the specific weight of the question it carried. "That," she said, "is exactly what I intend to find out." The Meridian dropped out of fold space 11 hours and 4 minutes after the message was sent. The Veltari Deep Range Observer stationed at the Cerithus outer perimeter, a young technician named Asa, 17 years old, on her first solo posting, currently eating a compressed nutrient block and reading a personal letter from her mother, nearly fell out of her chair. She had been told a human ship was coming. She had not quite believed it in any real, physical sense until the moment it appeared on her screen, and then she believed it completely, suddenly, and in a way that made the nutrient block taste like nothing at all. The Meridian was not what she expected. She had seen images of human vessels in her coalition orientation files. The files described them as asymmetric and iterative in design, which was diplomatic language for looks like it was built by someone who kept changing their mind. Human ships tended to be layered, modules added over time, sections retrofitted, and components from different eras bolted or welded or, in some cases, apparently tied together with flexible conduit in ways that made Veltari engineers quietly distressed. They were not beautiful. They were not elegant. But they were, the files noted carefully, extremely difficult to permanently disable, and the files did not fully explain why, as if the analysts who wrote them weren't entirely sure. The Meridian fit this description, and then some. It was large. Not large by coalition fleet standards, a coalition rescue vessel would dwarf it easily, but large for a single ship, and wide, built wide in a way that suggested it had been designed not for speed but for carrying. Its hull was dark, a deep anthracite gray mottled with repair patches of slightly different shades, like a quilt made by someone who cared more about warmth than appearance. Along its port side, Asa could make out what appeared to be a series of massive bay doors, each one large enough to park a mid-sized Veltari transport inside. A row of smaller hatches lined the starboard side, each one labeled in both human script and, she noticed, in 3 coalition standard languages. Someone had planned for this, had planned for others. At the bow of the ship, the blunt, wide, slightly dented bow, there was a name, stenciled in large white letters. Meridian. And beneath that, in smaller letters, Earth Continuance Vessel, Class, Open Threshold. Asa did not know what open threshold meant as a ship classification. It was not in her coalition files. She flagged it, noted it, and then opened the communication channel because Meridian was already hailing her, and she did not want to seem rude. The face that appeared on her screen was human, which she had prepared for, and therefore not startling. What was slightly startling was how calm it was. Captain Elena Vasquez was somewhere in her mid-40s by human reckoning, dark-haired, brown-skinned, with the particular quality of stillness that Asa had come to associate, through her coalition files, with humans who had been through things. Not serene stillness. Not empty stillness. The kind of stillness that is a decision maintained deliberately because the alternative is something you've already decided not to be. Her eyes, and humans had eyes, actual eyes, two of them, fixed and forward-facing, which Asa still found slightly unnerving, were dark and steady and already scanning the feed from Sarah, the station that Asa had automatically shared upon connection. "Observer," said Vasquez, her voice low and even. "I'm reading a hull fracture on the outer membrane of Ring 3, propagating toward the junction with Ring 4. I'm also reading a secondary stress point at the Ring 2 cooling manifold that your current alert system hasn't flagged yet. I need you to flag it now and get everyone in that sector into internal pressure suits."
"Can you do that?"
Asa stared. Yes," she said. "Yes, I can do that. How did you? Our long-range scans didn't." "We have a different kind of scanner," Vasquez said, without elaborating. "Flag the manifold. I'll be at docking bay 7 in 20 minutes. Please have someone there who speaks coalition standard and has authority to make decisions. Not a committee. One person." She paused. "And observer." A slight shift in her expression. Not a smile exactly. Something that lived in the neighborhood of a smile without committing. "Thank you for staying at your post. I know the situation wasn't what you expected today." The screen went dark. Asa sat very still for a moment. Then she flagged the Ring 2 cooling manifold, sent an emergency pressure suit advisory to the entire sector, opened a channel to the Veltri Council, and ate the rest of her nutrient block in one bite, knowing she would not have time to eat again for a long while. 22 minutes later, a small breach opened at the Ring 2 cooling manifold. The sector had already been evacuated. Docking Bay 7 had not been used in 3 years. This was not unusual for Sarah, the station. The station had been built 70 years ago, expanded twice, partially restructured once after a gravity anchor failure, and now existed in the way that very old, very large things exist, full of rooms and corridors and systems that had outlived their original purpose but had never quite been decommissioned, because decommissioning took resources and intention and someone with enough authority and enough time, and those three things rarely aligned. Bay 7 smelled of old polymer sealant and recycled atmosphere, as well as the particular metallic loneliness of spaces where nothing had happened in a long time. It did not smell that way for long. The Meridian docked with a precision that the Bay 7 automated systems, old, slow, and accustomed to being in charge of the process, simply could not keep up with. The ship did not wait for the docking guide beams. It found its line, matched it, and settled into the cradle with a low resonant thump that traveled through the floor and up into the legs of the 3 Veltri officials who had been sent to receive it. Those 3 officials were Station Administrator Marath, a worn-out, precise woman who had been running Cerathis for 12 years and had never once experienced a crisis of this magnitude. Her deputy, a younger Veltri named Korath, who was extremely competent and currently terrified, and a coalition observer named Sevdoral, who had no official function in this situation but had inserted himself into it anyway, because Sevdoral had a deep institutional suspicion of humans and felt that someone with suspicion should be in the room. The bay doors of the Meridian opened. Not the main cargo bay doors. Those stayed closed. The crew hatch, a medium-sized oval portal on the lower port side, clicked open, and a boarding ramp extended, and Captain Vasquez walked down it. She was not alone. Behind her came 4 humans, her immediate team, it appeared, each one different enough from the others that Merath found herself briefly cataloging them out of sheer administrative reflex. A tall, very thin man with pale skin and quick eyes who moved like he was always slightly ahead of himself. A broad, dark-skinned woman was carrying a case that appeared to be very heavy, and she appeared not to notice. A young person of indeterminate presentation, slight, quick-eyed, wearing a vest with so many pockets it seemed structurally load-bearing, who was already looking up at the bay's ceiling infrastructure with an expression Merath could not name, but that made her slightly nervous. And a fourth human, older and gray-haired, walked slowly, looked at everything, said nothing, and whose quietness somehow occupied more space than the other's movement. Vasquez reached the base of the ramp and stopped. She looked at Merath. "Administrator Merath," she said. It was not a question. "Captain Vasquez," Merath said. She straightened her membranes, which was the Velthary equivalent of squaring your shoulders. "We appreciate your response. However, I must be direct. The scale of the current emergency requires resources that a single vessel, however capable." "How many people can you move to internal emergency shelters?" Vasquez interrupted, not rudely, but with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided pleasantries were a resource she could not currently afford. Merath blinked. "Approximately 3,000, but the remaining 6,000 require transport," said Vasquez. "Yes." She half-turned and nodded toward the Meridian. "My ship carries 212 crew. We also carry, currently, 47 modular habitat units rated for 120 people each, a full-spectrum structural stabilization kit for autonomous breach sealing systems, a mobile atmosphere recycler, the kind that can be networked across multiple rings, and enough emergency rations for 10,000 people for 60 days. She paused. "We also carry a medical bay that runs on a separate power system from the rest of the ship, 3 surgeons, 2 trauma engineers, and a psychological support unit that I will explain later because I can see from your expression that you have questions about it, and we do not have time for them right now." Merath stared at her. The young person with a pocketed vest was still looking at the ceiling with that expression. "You came prepared," said Sevdoral, from his position slightly behind and to the left of Merath, in a tone that was meant to sound neutral but landed as suspicious. "This is a situation where you could not have known the specific parameters in advance." "No," Vasquez agreed. "We didn't know the specific parameters." "Then why?" "Because this is what we carry," she said simply. "All the time. Everywhere we go." A beat of silence. "The Meridian is an open-threshold vessel," said the tall, thin man behind Vasquez, in a conversational tone that suggested he was used to filling silences his captain left for others to enter. "It's a human classification. It means the ship is configured at all times for maximum unknown variable response. We don't know what we'll need before we get there, so we carry everything we might need. The weight cost is significant. The speed cost is significant. We've decided those are acceptable costs." "Who decided that?" Sevdoral asked. "The crew," said Vasquez. She said it with the flatness of a fact, not a boast. The young person with the pockets finally lowered their gaze from the ceiling. "Your Ring 3 junction brace is failing," they said, to no one in particular. "The secondary support filament along the upper quadrant, see how it's vibrating at a slightly different frequency than the primary? That's not thermal variation. That's stress resonance. It's been doing that for a while. Probably weeks." They looked at Merath. "You have maybe 9 hours before that brace fails completely. When it does, the junction won't collapse immediately. It'll torque, which is actually worse because torque failure is unpredictable in direction." They smiled, and it was a very young smile, the kind that doesn't know yet that it's saying too much. "I'm Pell, by the way. I do structures." Merath looked at the brace, then at Pell, then at Vasquez. 9 hours, she said. "Give or take," said Pell cheerfully. Vasquez looked at Merath steadily. "Tell me where you want us to start." They worked through what Sarah the station called the first sleep cycle, which, like most things on the station, had long since decoupled from any natural rhythm and simply meant a 12-hour block during which the lighting dimmed to 60% and the cafeteria switched from hot meals to cold ones. The Meridian crew did not sleep during the first sleep cycle. Merath, who had spent 12 years priding herself on the systematic, process-driven management of the station, found herself doing something she almost never did, following someone else's lead without resentment, because there was simply no time for it, and because the person in question was clearly good at this. Vasquez worked from a system she called triage layering, which she explained once, briefly, to Merath while they were both walking fast down Corridor 7C toward the Ring 3 junction. "You have 3 kinds of problems right now," Vasquez said, stepping over a collapsed ceiling panel without looking at it, because she had already noted it on her walk-in. "Problems that will kill people in the next 6 hours. Problems that will kill people in the next 24 hours and problems that will make everything harder but won't kill anyone immediately. You handle them in that order, and you do not let the third category steal time from the first 2. "That seems obvious," Merath said. "It seems obvious," Vasquez agreed. "When you're in the middle of it and someone is yelling at you about the third category, it stops seeming obvious." Within 4 hours, the Ring 2 cooling manifold breach had been sealed, not permanently, Pell cautioned, but well enough that it would hold through the full evacuation. The autonomous breach sealing systems had been deployed, 2 at Ring 3, 1 at Ring 5, and 1 in reserve. The modular habitat units had been moved into the station's largest open bay, Bay 12, which had been used as a storage overflow for the last 8 years and was cleared in 2 hours by a combination of Meridian crew and station volunteers who materialized with a speed and willingness that Merath found, unexpectedly, almost moving. People, it turned out, when given a clear task and a visible purpose, were excellent. The psychological support unit, which Vasquez had promised to explain, turned out to be a team of 3 humans whose function was not, as Sevdoral had initially and rather darkly suspected, manipulation or population management. It was something more straightforward and less categorizable. They moved through the station's corridors and gathering areas and spoke to people. Not in an official capacity. Not with clipboards or assessments. Just spoke to them. Listened. Found the people who were beginning to spiral into panic. Not loud panic, but the quiet kind that builds behind the eyes and then breaks suddenly and badly, and they sat with those people and they talked, and then those people were slightly steadier and could think more clearly and make better decisions and help others do the same. "You train people specifically for this?" Korath asked Vasquez, watching one of the support team, a soft-spoken man named Marcus, sit beside a Velthari family in the corridor, their membranes pale with fear, and simply hold the space with them, not intruding, not performing. "We've learned," Vasquez said, "that in a crisis, logistics saves lives. But people in panic make the logistics impossible. So yes, we train for it." Korath watched Marcus for a moment longer. "We do not have anything like this," he said. "I know," said Vasquez, and there was something in how she said it, not superior, not pitying, just aware, the way you are aware of something you have thought about at length and from many angles. It was during the 3rd hour of the sleep cycle that Merath found Vasquez alone for the first time. Or what passed for alone. They were standing at the Ring 3 junction observation port, looking out at the brace that Pell had flagged, watching the autonomous seal system work its slow, precise way along the fracture line. Merath had a question. She had been carrying it since the bay. "Captain," she said. "Merath. Why did you come?" Vasquez looked at the fracture. "I received a distress signal. You are not coalition. You have no obligation. This space is not your territory, not your species, not your station. The risk to your vessel and crew in approaching a compromised orbital structure with an unknown failure timeline was significant," Vasquez said. "Yes." "Then why?" Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone forming an answer. The quiet of someone deciding whether to give the real one is palpable. "Do you know what the word meridian means?" she said. Merath did not. "It's an old Earth navigational term," Vasquez said. "It refers to the highest point the sun reaches in the sky on a given day. The apex. The moment before descent." She paused. "We named the ship that because, in the early years of human deep space travel, when we were still losing ships regularly, still losing people, someone decided that every vessel should be named not for what it was, but for what it was moving toward. Some fixed point of maximum clarity. The highest point." She looked at the fracture line. We named it that because I believe, that the highest point any system can reach is the moment when it reaches toward something outside itself.
When it extends.
When it risks. Meritha's membrane flickered. Not pale yellow. Something she didn't have a name for. That is a very human way of thinking about it.
Probably, said Vasquez.
It is also, Merath said carefully, not entirely unlike something in the old Velthary resonance texts. A concept called velorith. It means, approximately, the sound a stone makes when it falls toward water. Before it lands. Vasquez looked at her. The moment of commitment, Merath said. Before the consequence. They stood together for a moment, watching the seal work. 7 hours left on that brace, Vasquez said. Yes, said Merath. They went back to work. Sevdoral did not trust the Meridian. This was not irrational. Sevdoral was a coalition observer, and coalition observers were trained specifically and deliberately to not trust things that appeared too convenient, too capable, or too willing. The universe, in his experience, did not produce those things without a reason, and the reason was rarely benign. So while Vasquez and her crew worked, and while Merath increasingly followed their lead, and while the station's population slowly, measurably stabilized, crisis still present, still real, but held now within a structure, a framework, a plan, Sevdoral moved quietly through the Meridian. He had not been invited, but he had not been told he couldn't, and in his experience, the space between those two things is where the most useful information lives. He had expected resistance. Security systems. Locked corridors. The particular blankness that military vessels put on when someone is inconveniently walking around inside them. Instead, he found an open ship. Not recklessly open. The engineering core was sealed, and the medical bay required biometric clearance, and there were certain sections near the bow that required crew escort. But the rest of the ship, the corridors, the cargo areas, the communal spaces, moved around him freely, as if it had been designed with the expectation that strangers would be inside it. He moved through a corridor on the middeck and found a large open room that took him a moment to understand. It was fitted with seating configurations for at least 8 different non-human body types. Velthary cradle chairs. Low Morkai platforms. Suspended harnesses that he recognized as Pale Expanse designs. And several arrangements he did not recognize at all, species he had never encountered or had not yet catalogued. The room was clearly a multi-species meeting space and was well used, with various seats worn, adjusted, and personalized in small ways, indicating they had been used many times by many different kinds of people. He stood in that room for a moment. He went deeper into the ship. He found a storage bay that housed the modular habitat units, 147 of them. Pell had said 47 were deployed, so the Meridian carried 194 total at full load. Enough to house 23,000 people at capacity. He ran the number, and then ran it again because it seemed wrong. It was not wrong. He found a secondary cargo hold that contained emergency supplies he had not been told about, atmospheric processing units for 6 different gas mixture environments, surgical equipment calibrated for at least 9 non-human biologies, and water reclamation units scaled for populations in the hundreds of thousands. He found a library. Not a data library, a physical library. Books. Physical books, in at least 30 languages, most of them not human. Some of them are very old. He stood in front of a shelf and ran his secondary hands along the spines. Velthary resonance, literature. Morkai philosophical cycles. The complete Pale Registry, which was a text so rare that only 4 physical copies were known to exist in the Coalition archives. He pulled out one of the Velthary texts. It was worn. It had been read, many times, by the feel of the page edges. He put it back. He found Vasquez's first officer, the tall, thin man whose name turned out to be Dr. James Okafor and who held 3 advanced degrees in what humans called crisis systems theory, eating something quietly in the crew mess. Okafor watched Sevdoral enter without surprise, gestured at a seat, and went back to eating. "You have been walking around my ship," Okafor said. "I have," said Sevdoral. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "I don't know yet," Sevdoral said. He sat down. "Why does this ship carry Velthary resonance literature?" "Physical copies." Well-read physical copies. Okafor considered this for a moment with the air of someone who has given a lot of thought to how much to say. Because we go places, he said finally, where Veltri people are. And when you go to a place where people are, you should know what they think. Not a summary. Not a brief. What they actually think. What they find beautiful. What they find worth writing down and keeping. He turned his cup in his hands. A crisis is not only a physical problem. It is also a cultural one. People in a crisis are not abstract. They are specific. They have histories and philosophies and things they are afraid of losing that are not on any damage report. Sevdoral was quiet. The psychological support team, he said. Part of it, yes. The multi-species meeting room. Also part of it. The atmospheric units for 6 non-human environments. We go where we're needed, Okafor said. We don't always know in advance who will be there. So we try to be ready for who will be there. He looked at Sevdoral steadily. We are not a military vessel, observer. We are not a diplomatic vessel. We don't carry weapons beyond basic crew protection. We carry, he paused, choosing the word, possibility. We will take as much as we can, in all the shapes it might need to take. Sevdoral sat with this. Why, he said at last. Okafor smiled. It was a tired smile, and a real one. Because nobody else was coming, he said. The brace failed at hour 6. Not hour 9. It was not the gentle, managed window that Pell had calculated with such confident specificity. Hour 6, during the most complicated part of the evacuation, when rings 4 and 5 were mid-transfer, when 3,000 people were moving through the connector corridors in a precisely orchestrated sequence, when 4 separate teams were managing 4 separate active systems simultaneously, when there was no slack in anything. The alarm was not loud. The station's alarm system, old, patchworked, with several generations of software layered on top of each other like sediment, produced a sound in ring 3 that most people initially interpreted as a ventilation glitch. 3 seconds before Pell looked at their structural monitor and said, with an entirely different quality of voice than they had used before,
Oh, no.
The junction torqued, not collapsed. Torqued, exactly as Pell had predicted. The failure moved not downward but sideways, a slow, grinding rotation of the primary support structure that sent fracture lines propagating outward in 3 directions simultaneously. The outer hull of Ring 3 developed 2 new breaches in 4 seconds. The pressure differential in Corridor 7C, the main evacuation artery for Ring 4, dropped by 9%. 9%. Enough. The automated pressure doors in 7C are sealed. 1,700 people were now cut off from their evacuation route, in a corridor with 4 hours of stable atmosphere and a structural prognosis that Pell, frantically recalculating, was now estimating at 2.5. Vasquez had been in the Ring 2 monitoring station when it happened. Merath, standing beside her, watched the captain receive the information, watched it travel across her face, and saw something she had not expected. Do not panic. Not even urgency in the way Merath understood urgency, as a thing that accelerates everything, that makes you faster and louder and more. Instead, Vasquez became more still. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. She stood completely still, and her eyes moved, not across the room but apparently across something interior, some map or framework or model that she was rapidly restructuring, reorienting, and finding the new shape of. Then she moved. Pell, she said, and her voice through the calm was perfectly level. How much load can the Ring 2 emergency bridge take? The bridge wasn't designed for. I know what it wasn't designed for. How much can it take? A pause. Rapid calculation sounds. If we redistribute the Ring 1 counterweight and disconnect the Ring 2 ornamental anchoring system, yeah, okay. With those modifications, maybe 1,100 people per hour. Safely. We don't have enough time for 1,100 per hour.
No.
What if we run it parallel with the Ring 3 service shaft? A longer pause. The service shaft has never been rated for personnel use. I know. What if we use it anyway? The pause this time was different. The sound of someone doing math that they do not like the variables of, but are doing anyway. 600 per hour through the shaft. 1,100 per hour through the bridge. If we run both simultaneously, it's 1700 per hour. Total evacuation window for the corridor population, a beat, 1 hour and 2 minutes. We have 2.5 hours, Vasquez said. We have 2.5 hours before the structural estimate becomes unreliable, Pell said, with the careful precision of someone who knows that precision matters more now, not less. At which point we might have 2 hours. Or 40 minutes. I cannot tell you which. Understood, said Vasquez. Prepare both routes. I need flow coordinators at both entry points in 8 minutes. And Pell.
Yeah.
Good catch on the brace. You gave us the time we needed. A brief silence on the line. The brace failed early, Pell said.
Yes.
And, because of your calculation, we had a sealed sector, distributed teams, and a prepositioned response. 3 hours ago, we didn't have any of those things. She paused. You gave us the time we needed. Another silence. Shorter. 8 minutes, Pell said, and clicked off. Marath had listened to this exchange in a state that was difficult to describe. Something was happening in her that was not alarm, or not only alarm, a kind of witnessing of something she didn't have clear categories for. A way of responding to crisis that was not the Veltri way, not the coalition way, not any way she had a name for. You thanked them, she said to Vasquez. In the middle of an active emergency. You took 4 seconds too. 2 seconds, Vasquez said, already moving toward the door. And yes, because Pell needed to hear it. And because it was true. And because the difference between a team that knows it is doing good work and a team that is not sure is, she held the door open for Marath. Not nothing. Come on. The evacuation of Corridor 7C took 1 hour and 19 minutes. Everyone made it out. The Veltri Council received hourly updates. They received them in the resonance chamber. Orthvel at the center, the other 11 members in their cradle chairs, reading the updates as they came through on resonance tablets and speaking very little, which was unusual for the council. Usually the chamber filled with careful, deliberate debate, each word spiraling back to its speaker, each position examined from every angle. Now there was only the sound of updates and the particular silence of people absorbing things they had not prepared to absorb. At the end of the second hour, Drev said, the breach in Ring 3 has been stabilized. At the end of the 4th hour, Prathso said, Corridor 7C evacuation complete. At the end of the 8th hour, Orthvel said nothing, because the update she had just received was not a progress report. It was a message, addressed to her personally, from Captain Vasquez. She read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time. Then she set it down and looked at the resonance tablet as if it were a stone that had been thrown through a window, and she was working out from where. What does it say? Asked Drev, because Drev always asked. Orthvel read it aloud. Council Speaker Orthvel, current status, 17 hours into the response. Primary evacuation complete. Secondary stabilization at 87%. We expect full structural security of rings 1 through 5 within 11 additional hours. Rings 6 and 7 are a longer project. I'll send a separate assessment. I'm writing for a different reason. I would like to understand something. When we arrived, I received this station's manifest. It listed 9,214 residents. I have since learned that this number was listed as provisional in the official Ceredis registry and that the station has been in deferred maintenance status for 3 years. I have also since learned that 2 separate formal requests for structural assessment were submitted to the Veltri Council in the past 18 months. Both were acknowledged. Neither received a response beyond the acknowledgement. I am not writing to accuse. I am writing because I genuinely do not understand. You are not a careless people. You are not an unkind people. The literature I have read, your resonance texts, your philosophical cycles, describes a culture of extraordinary depth and careful consideration. And yet this station, with 9,000 people on it, was in deferred maintenance status for 3 years while its structural integrity declined. I have seen such phenomena before. Not in your species specifically. In many. A gap between what a people believe about themselves and what their systems actually do. A gap so normalized that it becomes invisible. I am not asking these questions to shame you. I am asking because I want to understand it, and because I think you should understand it too, and because in my experience, the most dangerous thing a gap like this produces is multiple crises. It is the next one. With respect, Vasquez. The resonance chamber was very quiet. The words had spiraled back to each of them, slightly different and slightly older. She has no right, Prathso said, and her membrane was not pale yellow. It was a color Marath had never seen on Prathso before. Closer to red. She has every right, said Orithvel. She came when we did not. She is asking a question we should have asked ourselves.
She paused.
We will answer her honestly. Drev, who had started this whole sequence by saying that 9,000 people was not a large number, was looking at his hands. All 8 of them. He turned them over slowly and looked at both sides, and then folded them inward in the posture of deep uncertainty. I said, he said quietly, that 9,000 was not a large number. Nobody responded. I said it because it is mathematically true, he said. Against the scale of our population, against the cost of a response, against the resource allocation model, it is a defensible statement.
He paused.
It is also, he said, a sentence that a person says when they have allowed a system to replace their judgment. When the calculation has become so familiar that the thing being calculated has become abstract. The chamber waited. She is right, he said. There is a gap. And we are in it. Orithvel looked at him for a long time. Her membrane was dark, silver-threaded, and calm. Yes, she said. We are. And now we have to decide what to do about it. She picked up the tablet and began to compose her response to Vasquez. It took her a long time. The rock breathed around her. The words spiraled back. When she was done, it was only 2 sentences long. You are right.
Tell me what you saw that we could not.
Vasquez received Orithvel's response and sat with it for a moment. She was in the Meridian's small captain's cabin, the only truly private space on the ship, which she used rarely, because private space on a crisis vessel had a way of becoming a place where you sat with the weight of things that couldn't be put down, and she had long since made a policy of only picking that weight up when she had time to hold it properly. She had time now for a few hours. The evacuation was complete. The teams were on rotation. Hell was sleeping, finally, after 31 hours, with their structural models still running on a secondary screen beside their bunk, because Pell could not fully let go of a problem even unconscious, which was something Vasquez understood more than she found comfortable. She looked at Orithvel's 2 sentences. You are right.
Tell me what you saw that we could not.
She thought about what she could say. The technical answer was straightforward. The deferred maintenance flags, the unacknowledged structural reports, and the way a bureaucratic system could process information without anyone in it actually receiving it. She had seen that pattern many times. In human systems first, before she had started seeing it elsewhere. It had a specific texture, a specific sequence of causes and effects. But the council speaker had not asked for the technical answer. She had asked for what Vasquez saw. This was a different and braver question. Vasquez thought about the first time she had understood gaps. She had been 22. Not yet in deep space, that was still years away. She had been working as a structural engineer in Caracas on a retrofit project for a water reclamation facility in the outer districts. The facility was old. It served a population of 40,000 people. It had been sending maintenance requests for 6 years. Those requests had been received, acknowledged, and filed, and the filing had been taken as a form of action because the system had no clear mechanism for distinguishing between acknowledged and resolved, and so acknowledgement had gradually, invisibly, become equivalent to resolution in the minds of the people processing the requests. Nobody had intended for 40,000 people to have unreliable water for 6 years. The gap had not been cruelty. It had been architecture. The architecture of a system that processed inputs without anyone inside it being required to sit with the weight of what the inputs meant. She had thought about that facility many times in the years since. Every time she arrived somewhere, they had been waiting too long for something that should have come sooner. She began to write. The letter she wrote to Orithvel was long. It was the most careful document she had produced in years, not because she was trying to be diplomatic, though she was trying to be honest in a way that required care, but because she was trying to do something she had never fully tried before. She was trying to explain not what she had seen, but how she had learned to see it. The education she had received was not in any academy, but in the specific, recurring experience of arriving somewhere that had been forgotten and trying to understand not just what had broken, but why the breaking had been allowed to accumulate. She wrote about the water facility in Caracas. She wrote about a Morkai station she had visited years ago where a similar gap had produced a different crisis with a different texture, but the same underlying architecture. She wrote about the structure of systems that valued process over outcome and acknowledgement over action, and how that structure was never designed by anyone who wanted harm. It was designed by people who wanted order, and who confused the appearance of order for the thing itself. She wrote about what she called the distance problem. The way that scale creates abstraction, and abstraction creates distance, and distance makes it possible for people with genuinely good values to produce outcomes that those same values would have prevented if the distance had not been there. She wrote, "I do not think you are a cold person. You are a careful people in a system that rewards caution and does not penalize delay. Caution is a virtue. But any virtue, systematized and left unexamined, becomes something else. It becomes a mechanism. And mechanisms do not feel anything when the thing they are managing is in pain." She paused over that sentence for a long time. She sent the letter. She went back to work. On the third day, something shifted.
It was not a dramatic shift.
It did not announce itself. It happened in the small spaces between tasks, in the corridor conversations, and in the way that Valtteri station workers who had been initially polite and professionally distant began to move differently around the Meridian crew. Marath noticed it first. She noticed it the way an administrator notices things as a pattern, a data point, something that required categorization. But the category it required was not in her existing framework, and so she simply observed it without naming it. It started with Pell. Pell had been in near constant motion for 3 days, sleeping in 4-hour intervals, eating while walking, and communicating mostly in short declarative structural statements that were the verbal equivalent of pointing at something and then immediately pointing at the next thing. They were extraordinarily good at their job. The station's workers in Ring 3 had initially treated them with the respectful wariness that professionals extend to someone significantly younger than themselves who is also significantly more competent in a specific domain, a combination that creates a particular kind of uncomfortable friction. On the morning of the third day, a Valtteri structural technician named Bressel had been working alongside Pell on the Ring 3 junction reinforcement. Bressel was 53 years old, experienced, methodical, and not easily impressed. He had spent most of the first 2 days watching Pell work with an expression his colleagues couldn't read. On the morning of the third day, he asked Pell how they had learned to read structural resonance frequency. It was a small question, a technical question. But the way he asked it, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a genuine request, the kind you make when you have stopped protecting yourself and started being curious, changed the texture of the conversation. And Pell, who was 26 years old and had spent most of their adult life being the youngest person in every room and had developed a self-protective momentum that kept them always slightly ahead of the conversation, stopped. They stopped and looked at Bressel and answered the question. A real answer. Not a technical brief. An answer that included how Pell had learned, a teacher, a mentor, a failure in their second year that had made them rethink their entire approach to reading load-bearing data. An answer that was specific and personal, and that had the particular texture of something given freely rather than performed. Bressel listened. Then he told Pell about a structural failure he had observed 15 years ago in the Ring 7 substations that had puzzled him ever since, a resonance anomaly he had logged and never fully explained. Pell immediately said, "Oh, that's interesting," and meant it completely. They spent 40 minutes on Bressel's 15-year-old puzzle while the Ring 3 reinforcement continued around them, automatically, on its own momentum. Marath witnessed this from the far end of the corridor and felt something she did not expect. Not the warmth of successful collaboration. She had seen that before. Something older and stranger. Something more like recognition. At the same time, on the other side of the station, Marcus from the psychological support team was sitting in a common area with a group of 8 Valtteri residents who had been in one of the sealed sectors during the Corridor 7C event. They were not in acute distress anymore. The The worst of it had passed, but they were in the specific quiet that follows crisis, when the adrenaline has faded and the reality of what nearly happened moves in to fill the space. Marcus was not talking much. He was mostly listening, with the particular quality of listening that is not waiting for the other person to stop, but is actually interested in what they are saying and shows it. His membrane was, obviously, absent. He didn't have one. He had a face, which the Velthari still found somewhat spatially confusing, but his face had its own kind of transparency, its own expressiveness, and the residents had, slowly, in the way of very gradual things, begun to look at it without the slight, uncomfortable squint that human faces had initially produced. One of the residents, a middle-aged Velthari man named Oviret, had been telling a story about his family. Not a crisis story. A story from before, a memory of his grandmother, who had been a navigator on early Velthari deep space expeditions and who had told him, when he was very young, about the particular quality of fear that came with open space. There is no fear of danger. The fear of the scale. The fear arises when a person genuinely understands, in their body rather than their mind, how very small and impermanent a single life is in a universe that will continue without it. She told me, Oviret said, that she had found a way to make the fear into something else. Not courage. She was clear that it wasn't courage. She called it, he paused, his membrane flickering. She called it Velsorithar. It means, approximately, the willingness to matter only briefly. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I think we have something like that, he said. We say, it is enough to do good now, even though I won't remember it, even though it won't last. He paused. My grandmother had a version of it too. Oviret looked at him. Your grandmother, he said. She was a nurse, Marcus said, in a city that was going through a difficult time. She worked for 40 years. She said that most of the people she helped, she never heard from again. Most of them she couldn't have picked out of a crowd a year later. But the help was real. The moment was real. And that was enough. They sat together in the quiet for a moment. The station breathed around them, repressurizing, restabilizing, learning its new shape. You are a very strange species, Oviret said, but not unkindly. I know, said Marcus. We've been told. Sevdoral wrote his official observer's report on the 4th day. He had been writing observer reports for 22 years. They followed a standard format: incident summary, response assessment, systemic observations, and recommendations. They were read by a committee, filed, occasionally excerpted for coalition policy briefings, and, in his private assessment, had influenced exactly nothing in the entire 22 years he had been writing them. He wrote this one differently. He kept the standard sections, but within them, he wrote things he had not written before. He wrote them carefully, in the precise, measured language of his profession, but he could feel, even as he wrote, that they were different in a way that his professional language was not quite adequate to carry. Under response assessment, he wrote about the meridian with the same factual precision he would use for any vessel: its tonnage, its classified capability profile, its response time, and its deployment of resources. Then he added a section that was not in the standard format. He labeled it Structural Philosophy, and he wrote, the ECV Meridian represents a class of vessel whose design philosophy differs fundamentally from coalition rescue doctrine in ways that this observer considers significant. Coalition rescue doctrine is predicated on scalable response, matching the scope of response to the known scope of the incident. This system is efficient and resource-conserving. It is also, structurally, reactive. It responds to what is already known. The Meridian's open threshold classification represents an alternative doctrine, maximum unknown variable preparation, deployed at constant readiness, with significant cost in speed and efficiency and corresponding benefit in response to unforeseen complexity. In the Cerithus incident, this doctrine proved decisive. The vessel's prepositioned resources address several critical failure points that developed after arrival, which a standard scaled response vessel would not have been equipped to handle. The crew describes the decision to carry this configuration as a collective one. Not a command decision. Not an institutional mandate. A collective decision by the ship's crew about what to carry and how much to pay. This situation is unusual. This observer does not know what to do with it taxonomically. but it seems relevant. Under systemic observations, he wrote about the gap. He used the word gap, which was not a standard coalition technical term, but he found it accurate in a way that the technical vocabulary was not. He wrote about Cerethas's deferred maintenance history. He wrote about the 2 structural reports that had been acknowledged but ignored. He wrote about what he had come to think of as the acknowledgement as resolution error, and he cited 3 other incidents in coalition history where a similar pattern had produced similar consequences. Incidents he had filed reports on that had been read by committees and filed but not acted upon. He paused here. He wrote, "This observer notes with some discomfort that his own reports on similar systemic patterns over the preceding 2 decades have followed the same pathway, acknowledged, filed, not acted upon, and that this failure of response has occurred within the same institutional system that this observer serves. It is possible that this report will follow the same pathway. This observer is writing it anyway because the alternative is silence, and because the ECV Meridian and its crew have demonstrated, with some clarity, that arrival matters even when it is not sufficient." He paused again. He thought about Okafor in the crew mess. Nobody else was coming. He thought about the multi-species seating room, the worn chair cushions. The physical copy of the Pale Registry has been read many times by hands that had no particular obligation to hold it. He thought about Vasquez standing at the Ring 3 observation port with Merath, talking about the highest point the sun reaches and the sound a stone makes before it lands in water. He finished the report. At the bottom, below the standard signature line, he added something that was not in the template and that no observer he knew of had ever added before. It was only a few words. "If this is read by anyone with the authority to act on it, please do. The people of Cerethas Station existed in a gap that this system produced. The gap is still here. The Meridian will not always be in range." He sent the report. Then he did something he had not planned to do. He walked back to the Meridian and asked one of the crew to bring him to Vasquez. She met him in the multi-species room. She was sitting in a Velthary cradle chair, sitting in it slightly wrong because her spine didn't curve the way a Velthary spine curved, but making it work, eating something quickly and reading 3 things simultaneously on a portable display. She looked up when he came in.
"Observer," she said.
"I wrote a report," he said. "I know. I'll read it. It says things I have not said before. In a report." She put down the display. She looked at him steadily. "Was it true?" she said. "Yes." "Then it was worth writing."
She paused.
"Even if nothing happens." "Even if nothing happens," he repeated. And then, because he was a precise man and precision required honesty, "I'm not sure I believe that yet. But I wrote it as if I did." Vasquez looked at him for a moment. That quality of stillness. That decision is maintained. "That's usually how it starts," she said. On the morning of the 6th day, the Meridian prepared to leave. Rings 1 through 5 were stable. The habitat units were in place, the breach seals confirmed, the atmospheric recycler networked and running, and the structural reinforcement on the Ring 3 junction solid enough for a 3-year operational window, Pell's conservative estimate, which meant it would probably hold for 5. Rings 6 and 7 required longer work that the station's own crews were now equipped to do, with the detailed assessments and repair protocols that Pell had left them, annotated in both standard and Velthary technical notation, because Pell had spent 2 of their sleep intervals learning enough Velthary structural vocabulary to make the annotations useful rather than merely symbolic. Station Administrator Merath stood in Docking Bay 7 and watched the Meridian prepare to retract its boarding ramp. Most of the station had come to the bay. Not all. Many residents were still in the habitat units, still recovering, still returning to something like normal, but enough that the bay was full in a way it had not been in years. Velthary of all ages, standing in their distinctive segmented stillness, membranes in a dozen different colors, many of which Merath could not immediately read. Which itself was unusual. She could almost always read her people. Vasquez came down the ramp last. She had a bag over one shoulder, not a large bag, not a ceremonial one, just the bag she traveled with, slightly worn, with a small patch on one strap that had been repaired and re-repaired until the patch was larger than the original strap. She stopped at the bottom of the ramp. She and Merath looked at each other. Merath had prepared something to say. She had been preparing it since the second day, revising it mentally, getting the words right, because the Velthari took the giving of words seriously. Words were not casual, words were Velorith, the sound before the landing, and you chose them with care. She had prepared something formal and complete and right. She said, I did not know what to do with you when you first arrived. I kept trying to put you in a category I already had. Coalition, military, diplomatic. I kept trying to understand what you wanted from this. Vasquez waited. I think, Marath said slowly, that you wanted nothing. That the wanting was not the organizing principle. That something else was. She paused. I do not have a word for it in standard translation. We have the concept, but we keep it in the old literature. Velorith. The moment before the stone lands. The commitment that exists before the consequence. I know that term, Vasquez said quietly. I know you do. Marath paused. I was going to give you something ceremonial. A formal commendation. A council marker. Something that said, you did a thing and we acknowledge it. But that seemed... She stopped. It seemed like the wrong shape of response. It would be generous, Vasquez said. It would be acknowledgement, Marath said. And we have learned, this week, that acknowledgement is not sufficient. She looked at Vasquez steadily, her dark charcoal membrane still. What I want to give you is something that cannot be formalized. I want to give you my word that I will be the kind of administrator who does not allow gaps, who does not allow acknowledgement to substitute for action, who does not process a report and consider it resolved.
She paused.
I cannot guarantee I will succeed. Systems are large, and I am one person inside one. But I can tell you that I will try with the kind of trying that is not comfortable, the kind that costs something. Vasquez held her gaze. That's enough, she said. That's actually plenty. Bressel was in the crowd. He raised one of his 8 hands in a gesture that Pell, from inside the ship, somehow saw through the bay's external camera, and Pell lifted a hand back. Marcus was already inside the ship, but Oviaret was in the bay, and Oviaret lifted his hand in the same gesture, slightly uncertain of the form but clear enough in the intention. Sevdoral was standing near the back of the crowd. He did not lift his hand, but he stood with a different posture than he had stood with when he arrived, something in the set of his shoulders and the angle of his head that was harder to describe than lifting a hand but was, in its way, more significant. He looked like someone who had set something down that they had been carrying for a very long time and was not yet sure what to do with their hands without it. Vasquez walked back up the ramp. At the top, she paused. She turned back and looked at the bay, at the crowd, at Marath, at the station with its repaired rings and its new structural assessments and its 9,214 people, and she looked at it with the full weight of attention that the thing deserved. Then she went inside. The ramp retracted. The bay doors sealed. The Meridian undocked with the same quiet precision with which it had arrived, finding its own line, releasing cleanly and moving away from the station in a long, slow arc that took it first through the outer perimeter and then toward the fold space entry point, growing smaller against the dark. Asa, back at her long-range observer station, watched it go. She had been given a personal message, relayed through the bay from Marcus. It was a brief message. It said, "You flagged the manifold fast and clean. That sector was clear before the breach. You did that." She read it 3 times. The Meridian reached the fold space entry point. It folded.
Gone.
Asa sat in the silence of her station and looked at the empty space where the ship had been. Caro, she said softly to no one. It was an old, untranslatable word, the kind that carries more meaning than its sounds suggest, the kind that contains a whole philosophy in 3 syllables. In the old Velthari resonance texts, it appeared most often at the endings of things, the end of a cycle, the end of a great journey, the end of a passage that had changed the reader. It meant something close, and now this becomes part of what was always going to happen. It meant I received this. It meant I will not waste it. She sat for a moment longer. Then she picked up her comm and opened a channel to Station Administrator Marath. "Administrator," she said, "I've been reviewing the Ring 6 structural assessment that Pell left us. I suspect there is a secondary resonance anomaly in the Ring 6 service corridor that wasn't in the original report. I'd like permission to investigate it before it becomes a maintenance flag.
A pause.
Granted, said Marath, and there was something in her voice. Quiet, steady, the sound of a decision held. Report your findings directly to me. Yes, Administrator. Asa put down the comm. She picked up Pell's annotated structural assessment and began to read. The question never fully went away. In the days after the Meridian left, it circulated through Sarah Station in the way that certain questions do, not loudly, not as debate, but as a kind of recurring murmur that appeared in conversations and then disappeared and then appeared again, slightly changed, as if the station itself was working on it. Why did they send one ship? The obvious answers had been given and found insufficient. Because only one ship was available. The distance made a larger response impractical. This was because the Meridian was in the region. These were true, but they were not the answer. The question was not really about logistics. Bressel, in the Ring 3 maintenance corridor on the 8th day after the departure, working the long reinforcement job that would take another 2 weeks, told the young Veltri technician working beside him what he thought. It was not a limitation, he said. They sent one ship because they built one ship that could be enough. They built a ship that carries everything it might need, at cost to itself, without knowing in advance what that need will be. He ran his hands along the junction brace, the new one, the solid one, the one that would last. The question is not why they sent one ship. The question is what kind of choice goes into building a ship that way. It means something about the people inside it, what it means about what they think the universe requires of them. The young technician considered this. It requires a lot of them, he said. Yes, said Bressel. It does. In the Veltri Council chamber, Orthvel had done something unprecedented in the 312-year history of the Council. She had placed an item on the permanent standing agenda, an item that could not be tabled, could not be deferred, and could not be acknowledged and filed. It was called, in the official Council record, the Velorith Review, a quarterly examination of every outstanding request in the Council system that had been acknowledged but not resolved, with mandatory discussion and a mandatory decision within 30 days. Drev had proposed the name. He had also proposed the mechanism and written the framework and had worked on it with the concentrated focus of someone doing penance, not performative penance, but the real kind, the kind that looks forward rather than backward, that is oriented not toward the punishment of past error, but toward the prevention of future harm. When the first Velorith review convened, there were 47 outstanding requests in the system. Some were small. Some were very much not small. 2 of them, Orthvel noticed, were from stations in the outer belt that had been sending maintenance flags for longer than Sarathis had been sending them. She allocated a response team to both within the same session. Neither required the Meridian. Neither required a fleet. Both required someone to close the distance, to sit with the weight of what the reports actually meant, to receive them not as information to be processed, but as people waiting to be heard. It was slow. It was imperfect. The Council remained large, the system remained heavy, and the distance problem persisted, because one administrator chose to resist it. But the first review happened, and the second, and the third. Orthvel received one more message from Vasquez. It arrived 6 weeks after the departure. It was short, which she had come to understand as a characteristic of Vasquez's writing, short not from brevity of thought but from precision, from the habit of giving exactly the words that were needed and trusting them to carry what they were meant to carry. It said, Council Speaker, we are at a station in the pale expanse. Different situation, different species, same gap. I find that the gaps are usually in the same place. Not in the systems that fail, but in the distance between the people running those systems and the people those systems are meant to serve. I don't know how to close that distance permanently. I'm not sure anyone does. But closing the distance is the work, not the completion of the closing. The act of closing is an ongoing, daily, and costly process. You asked me what I saw that you could not. I think what I saw was this. I came from outside. The gap can be invisible from inside because it has been there long enough to seem like the room's shape. Of SY and JHY Mui Yakin Hai, I believe, from here, that you can see it now.
V.
Orthvel read the letter in the resonance chamber, alone, in the deep quiet of a Veltri night. The walls breathed around her. She read the last line again. It was written in a language she did not fully know, a human language, not English, older, warmer, the kind of language that sounds like it was designed to carry weight across long distances. She ran it through her translation archive and received what the archive offered, a mechanical rendering, flat and approximate. But the meaning came through. From here, I believe you can see it now. She set the tablet down. She sat in the resonance chamber, in the cradle chair that matched her exactly, in a rock that had been shaped by 41-year rotations around 2 dying stars, and she felt the shape of the message against her membrane, the warmth of it, the weight of it, and the specific frequency of a thing said truthfully across a very great distance. Kairos, she thought. And now this becomes part of what was always going to happen. She picked up the tablet. She began to write back.
End.